There's a moment that doesn't get talked about much in leadership. It's not the moment where things fall apart. It's actually the moment when things finally work. The team is stepping up and productive. Decisions are getting made without you. Problems are getting handled even before they reach your desk, and sometimes before you even hear about them. And for a while, that feels exactly what it should feel like. Because it is. This is what good leadership produces. People who don't need you for every decision. An organization that can carry its own weight. And you built towards this. You wanted this. And yet, there's something in that space that doesn't quite feel right. It's the shift in how the day feels. A change in the rhythm you didn't realize you'd been keeping. For a long time, the shape of your value was clear. Something came up, you stepped in. Something needed attention, you handled it. There was a pull, and you answered it. You knew exactly where you fit. But then the pull starts to change, just enough that you notice it. Those moments that used to tell you where you stood, well, they don't show up the same way anymore. And nothing quite replaces them. So there's a space that opens up. More room than you're used to. More quiet than you've had in a long time. And somewhere in that quiet, a question starts to form. What does my value look like now when I'm not being needed in the same way I used to? That question shows up in that quiet moment when things are actually working. And it lingers and creates a bit of tension. There's something about the way whiskey is made, specifically what happens to the person making it, that gives us an honest picture of what's happening in that moment. At a small craft distillery, there's usually one person who moves through the entire process, the Master Distiller. They don't hand off to specialists at each stage. They stay with it, from the beginning to the bottle. But here's what that actually means. At the start, their job is about selection and control. They choose the grain, the ingredients, the mash bill. They decide what goes in before anything begins. And that decision matters deeply. Because whatever goes into the mash bill is what comes out the other side. Then there's the still, where heat is applied. Everything inside begins to separate. And in the process, the distiller has to make a cut, which is the most critical decision in the entire process. The first part of the run is cut because it's too harsh, too rough. The last part gets cut because it's too weak and too thin. What remains is the middle, called the hearts. This is the purest expression of what this was always becoming. And then, the distiller's job changes. The spirit goes now into the barrel, and the distiller's job is now to just step back. Not away, but back. Because this stage doesn't need the version of them that selected the grain. It doesn't need the version that managed to still or the version that needed to make the perfect cut. This stage needs a distiller who can tend, who can wait, who can move barrels in a dark rickhouse without knowing exactly what's forming inside of them, who can resist the urge to keep doing what worked in the last stage because that version of the job is done. The spirit is aging. Character is forming, and the distiller's presence in this season looks almost nothing like it did in the last one. That's the process working exactly the way it's supposed to. The question is whether the distiller knows which stage they're in. This is where a lot of leaders find themselves. Not facing bad performance, not disengaged, not checking out. They're still busy, still leading, but carrying a question they haven't said out loud yet. If I'm not being needed in the way I used to be, what does that say about who I am? That's not a strategy question. It's not an operational question. That's an identity question. And it runs underneath everything else that looks completely fine. Back in 2013, I spent 2 weeks in the Czech Republic. I was part of a missions team working with high school students at a music camp. But before I get to what happened there, I want to share a little bit about how I'm wired. My default, for as long as I can remember, is to be the one who steps in. Not from a need to control, but from a sense of, this is my responsibility. This is where I add value. So when I landed in Czech, I was thousands of miles from home, 13 hours ahead in time zone. In 2013, international roaming was unreliable at best, and most of the times non-existent. And something happened that I wasn't prepared for. If something came up back at home, I wasn't able to step in. Not remotely, not later, not at all. The version of me that always knew where it stood, that always had somewhere to go, now had nowhere to go. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't worried. I trusted completely that things were fine back home. But it was something else. The reflex kept running when there was nothing to step into. My mind kept reaching back home the way that you'd reach for something that's always been there, and it found empty space instead. And I didn't like noticing that about myself. Because I was on this trip for a reason. Students in front of me, 2 weeks that mattered, and part of me kept leaving the room. So I had to make a choice. Was I going to keep reaching back, or was I going to be present for what was right in front of me? And what was right in front of me required a completely different version of myself. Not the one who steps in, not the one who handles things. Just present. Just there. Just paying attention. I had brought a guitar with me on that trip. It had belonged to a man named Gary, a musician who had poured his life into ministry, into music, and into people. He had traveled to Czech many times. He died before I made this trip. His family entrusted me with his guitar to carry it back to the place that he loved and leave it with someone who might carry something of his forward. So I was already holding something that wasn't mine to control. I just had to pay attention. There was this girl at the camp. She was from Ukraine. She kept coming to our guitar workshops, not just attending, but actually practicing. She'd find me between sessions and asked if she could borrow the guitar so she could keep working on what we were teaching her. I can only imagine the courage it took a teenager in a second language to keep seeking out an adult she barely knew, just to get more time with an instrument. At a break before the final concert, I sat down with her and I told her Gary's story. I asked her if she wanted to keep the guitar. Her eyes filled. She was visibly moved, and she said yes. But then about an hour later, she found me, and she told me that she couldn't accept it. She wanted me to find someone who needed it more. The guitar came home, and the relationship stayed in Czech. The setting was different than the one you're navigating, but the disruption underneath it is the same. The version of yourself that knew exactly how to show up, that had a clear role, a clear signal, and a clear way of confirming value, had nowhere to go. And what was left had to be enough. You probably have a version of this, a season where the performance had nowhere to go, where showing up was the only thing available, where you couldn't see what you were building while you were building it. Here's what's interesting about this particular tension. It's not really about the role. It's about what happens to the role over time. Because when you've led something long enough, when you've been the one who stepped in, handled it, stayed close, the role doesn't just describe what you do. It starts to answer the question of who you are. And when that happens, something else changes underneath it. Performance becomes the way you prove the identity is real. Step in, handle it, be needed. That's just not contribution anymore. That's confirmation. I showed up. I was useful. I matter here. And for a long time, that works just fine because the season requires it. The organization needs that version of you, and you need the signal it sends back. But then the season changes. Less pull, less urgency, less dependence. The team handles what used to come to you. The problems get solved before you even hear about them. And the performance that used to confirm identity, well, that starts to quiet down. You didn't lose value. The organization has grown past needing you in the way it once did, which should feel like success. And it does. And it also feels like something you don't quite have the words for yet. If I'm not stepping in, if I'm not the one being needed in that way, who am I in this? That's not a management question. That's an identity question. And it deserves more than a productivity framework. And here's where the distiller gives us something honest. A master distiller moves through the entire process, but the job looks completely different depending on where they are. There's a control season, where their hands are in everything. Selecting the grain, running the still, making the cut, decide what moves forward. Active, visible, immediate. You can feel the impact of every decision. Then when the spirit goes into the barrel, the distiller moves into a stewarding season. They're still present, still essential, but the job looks almost nothing like it did before. Now they tend. They wait. They move barrels in a dark rickhouse without being able to see what's forming inside. They have to resist the urge to intervene because this stage doesn't require intervention. It needs patience. It needs presence. It needs a distiller who knows that the work is happening is real work, even when it doesn't confirm itself the way it did the last season did. And eventually, not yet, but eventually comes the alignment season. The bottling, the finished spirit, the moment when what was always forming finally expresses itself fully. This is the what we're building for moment. Identity, purpose, moving in the same direction. But you don't get there by staying in the control season. And you don't get there by skipping the stewarding season. You get there by knowing which season you're in and showing up as the version of yourself that the season actually needs. Most leaders sit in this tension are somewhere in the stewarding season. They've built something real in the control season. Their hands shaped it. The presence held it together. And the work was necessary. It was good. It was them. But the organization has moved, and intentionally so. And the question isn't whether they're still valuable. The question is whether they know which version of themselves this season is asking for. Not the one who ran the still, not the one who made every cut, the one who tends what's forming, the one who shows up without needing the signal back, the one who trusts that presence is doing something that performance never could. That's what Czech required of me. The performance had nowhere to go, no place to step in, nothing to handle. No way to reach back across time zones and the distance and be the version of myself where I placed my value. Just the workshops, the guitar, and the girl who kept coming back. The work of being present in a season, not knowing what it was building. I didn't know which moment mattered. And it turns out that wasn't mine to know. 14 years had passed since that mission trip ended when one day on Facebook I saw her name in a post. She was asking for help, not reaching out to me specifically, just putting something into the world and hoping someone who cared would see it. And I almost kept scrolling because my honest assumption, one I've carried my entire life, is that people don't remember me. I can remember almost every face, name, and conversation, but I've always assumed it doesn't go the other direction. So when I reached out privately, it said plainly, "Not sure if you remember me. It's been 14 years. She wrote back. She remembered me. She told me I made a huge impact on her life. And then she shared what was happening. The war in Ukraine just beginning. Her father's health failing because of the bombing. I was able to contribute in a small way to help with her father's care. But what stayed with me wasn't the ability to help. It was this. When things fell apart, she put something into the world, and something in me recognized her name and chose not to scroll past. 14 years later, and I can't point to a single conversation that built that. I can't identify the moment where trust formed. I can't trace it back to a workshop or a session or the guitar she borrowed and handed back and never kept. It came from all of it. The showing up. The presence that happened when I finally stopped reaching back. The relationship that formed in the space between the measurable moments. I couldn't see it while it was happening. But because what I was building didn't operate on the timeline I was trying to measure it in. That's the rickhouse in the distillery. What made sense when you were running the still doesn't apply in the rickhouse. Transformation of the whiskey is still happening. And if I had spent those 2 weeks in Czech mentally reaching back home, filling every quiet moment with the version of myself that steps in and handles things, I would have been physically present and completely somewhere else. And she would have practiced the guitar alone. And 14 years later, I probably would have scrolled past her name because that connection wasn't there. Showing up is what we're called to do, but it shows up differently in different seasons. If you've ever gone to a whiskey tasting, you take notes on what you taste, what you notice, and what you want to remember. Here are a few things worth sitting with from this one. Which season are you in right now? Controlling? Stewarding? Alignment? Not which one do you want to be in, which one the work is actually asking you to be in. And are you showing up as the version of yourself that the season requires? Or are you still trying to run the still when the spirit is already in the barrel? When the performance quiets down, when there's less to step into, less to handle, what do you feel underneath it? Not what to do about it, just what's there. Because if the role has become the identity, the quiet just doesn't sit like a slower season. It feels like a question about who you are. And is there someone, somewhere, that you poured presence into without knowing what it was building? A relationship that didn't confirm itself. A season of showing up that didn't feel like enough. Don't be too quick to answer that one. The confirmation may still be forming. These tasting notes are available as a free download at craftedclarity.net. No login required. There's space there to write, to sit with what surfaced today, and to take this further than a single listen. The Master Distiller doesn't grieve every stage they leave behind. They know the mash bill work was real. The cuts were necessary, and the still did exactly what it was supposed to do. And now the barrels are doing their work. The most patient, least visible job in the entire process. Tending what's forming, showing up in the dark, trusting that time is doing something that control never could. That's the stewarding season. And the distiller who knows which stage they're in, who can release the last version of the job and show up as the version this season needs, is the one who makes it to the bottle. The one who gets to taste all of what the formation was for. If you're in this stage right now, the question isn't whether you're still valuable. The question is whether you can trust what the season is building without needing to see it yet. And remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. Thanks for listening to Crafted Clarity. If you're a leader wrestling with the tension between success and significance, or if you're trying to align your work with a deeper calling, I'd love to connect with you. If your organization is facing questions about strategy, whether it's alignment, ROI, or building confidence in your team, this is the work we do every day at iBrand. And if you walk this journey yourself, or maybe you're right in the middle of it, I'd love to hear your story and maybe even share it here on the podcast. You can find me at craftedclarity.net.